In this video, I want to talk about Alan Watts, non-duality, and maybe a practice or two, an exercise on getting to the experience of non-duality rather than just thinking about it. And if you were to ask and say, okay, who's been the biggest influence in terms of the path that you've taken? Well, it would have to be Alan Watts. He had some magical ability to take Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, and he could weave it together into this message that some kind of Westerner could understand and feel and go beyond thinking itself and get the essential message. But of course, if you're watching this, if you're a fan of Alan Watts, if you've read or listened to his lectures, you know where this is going. Because for 30 years now, whenever I bring Alan up, the very first thing people who are at least a little familiar with his life will say is, well, if Alan was so enlightened, why couldn't he stop drinking? Why did he drink himself very likely into an early death? And Alan's not the only one. Nisargadatta, an amazing spiritual teacher, another one of my absolute favorites, that smoked cheap cigarettes his whole life and ended up dying from throat cancer. Why couldn't he stop if he was so enlightened and live a little bit longer life and teach more? Well, all this judgment, why couldn't Alan quit drinking? Why couldn't Nisargadatta stop smoking? All that judgment is coming from the thinking mind, imposing its ideas on what it believes a non-dual universe would be like, instead of experiencing that non-duality is beyond the good and the bad. And so, rather than thinking too much, let's get creative. And the coolest thing about the creative process is it gets us out of our thinking mind, because thinking alone is very limited and it's incredibly uncreative because it's like a computer program. It just runs these routines, ending up in the exact same place, usually the same place that it started, and totally unaware of this whole irony. But when we get creative, that's when you become open to where does creativity come from? Where does imagination come from? And it's certainly not the thinking mind. So let's do a practice on imagination. And let's imagine that there is one unified consciousness, intelligence, beyond anything the thinking mind could possibly comprehend by this 3 pounds of gelatinous goo in our skull. And it's what we would refer to as non-duality. So it's manifesting, playing this game of being everything that it isn't. So it manifests as the material world. It manifests as individuals. Right now it's manifesting as you, playing a game of being exactly what it isn't by being an individual who's experiencing time and space and localization of all these things. And it's playing me right now, talking about such things. And at one point in life, it played Alan Watts, the story of Alan Watts. So, in this imagination, let's remove all the judgment and consider the possibility, feel the possibility that Alan's life was perfect the way it was. That this cosmic intelligence knows what it's doing way more than the thinking mind could ever comprehend. And when it created the artful work of Alan Watts, it did every single part of it exactly as it should be. When it sang the Song of Alan, each melody, each line, each pause, even ending the song a little early, was part of the perfect manifestation of Alan Watts. And feel if you can get that going. Even pause the video if you need to. And when you get that feeling, like maybe it was perfect, then apply that to your own life. What if what's going on in your version, this uniqueness, your unique manifestation, your unique song that the universe is singing through you, instead of judging it with the thinking mind and saying, well, this thing went wrong and this mistake I made, instead of focusing on the judgments of the thinking mind, consider that it was all a perfect melody, perfectly placed, and it's all playing out exactly as this architect of cosmic consciousness is manifesting it moment by moment. And when you get that going, because again, what's going to happen is the thinking mind is going to come back online here and there, and it's going to have questions about judgment. Well, if this and this, I would have done this differently, because that's the thinking mind. It's a good servant, but it's a terrible master. It wants to, everybody wants to rule the world, but it's every thinking mind that wants to rule the cosmos. And it believes it could do such a better job. But when you get into this, so when we get creative and we get this imaginary place of creativity, it's possible, just consider that it's possible that this greater intelligence actually knows exactly what it's doing. Not knowledge in terms of thought, but every manifestation is exactly as it was intended. And Alan's life was exactly as it should be, as yours and as mine, and everything is actually working out beautifully and perfectly and harmoniously. And when you start to feel that, that's the experience of non-duality, rather than thinking about it with judgment.